It looks like we have everyone here. I'm Jim Cole. I'm president of the Washington Academy of Sciences. First of all, I'd like to welcome you all here tonight. I'm glad that you can join us. Our moderator tonight is Kathy Harrigan. She has a company, a bookstore, Mystery Loves Company in Oxford, Maryland. This is the 4th year that we've done this. And she will be moderating the talk, and her website is mysterylovescompany.com, so it's very easy to find. Thank you, Kathy.
Jim, there's still people out there. Jim, still people out there.
Tribune. Good evening. My name is Kathy Harrigan. I'm the owner of Mystery Loves Company Booksellers in Oxford, Maryland, on the Eastern Shore. And Peg and I got together several years ago and decided this would be a fun thing to do, which is basically to have you meet some of the people who are writing in the fields of mystery, horror, thrillers, romance, suspense, and using science heavily in their books. The collection we have this evening are actually people that are fairly local. They're from Virginia and Maryland. We have had people from farther afield, I remember, but okay. Harrison Demchek, all the way down there, is the deputy publisher, editor, screenwriter, marketing association, and odd jobs guy at the Bancroft Press. Raised in Baltimore on a steady diet of magical realism, literary fiction, science fiction, and Spider-Man comics, Harrison Demchek spent most of his formative years inside his own head, working on strange thoughts and ideas that would eventually make their ways into stories and screenplays. And his book is called The Listeners. Harrison went to Oberlin College with a BA in English, with creative writing concentration, and then actually used it, working for the last 7 years as a book editor. He's also a screenwriter and the winner of the 2011 Baltimore Screenwriters Competition. John Gilstrap is the New York Times bestselling author of 9 thrillers: Damage Control, Threat Warning, Hostage Zero, No Mercy, 6 Minutes to Freedom, Nonfiction, and Scot-Free, Even Steven, At All Costs, and Nathan's Run. Threat Warning is a thriller nominee this year, having been already named Best Book of 2011 by Suspense Magazine. His novels have been translated to more than 20 languages, and John has also adapted 4 best-selling novels for the big screen, including works by Thomas Harris and Nelson DeMille. He's currently signed to write the screen adaptation for his book 6 Minutes to Freedom for Sesso Entertainment. Diane Davidson is half of the writing team of Maddie Davidson. Diane's most recently worked for Marriott International in IT strategy and planning, helping to inflict new technologies on unsuspected victims. Her 2 new books are called Outsourcing Murder and Denial of Service. Alexander Hamlin is the Harvard-educated cultural anthropologist who's also an international lecturer and defense anthropologist. She is a former radio host and journalist and an international consulting lecturer in cultural affairs and international business. She presently leads the Washington, D.C. office for search firm, an executive search partner and consultant for special and senior level positions worldwide. Her interests and adventures include being an auxiliary nurse in London, participation in NASA's Journalist in Space program, international business and cultural lecturer, and consultant including North America, the Pacific Rim, and the Far East. She's a special student and visiting fellow at Harvard University and a consultant on irregular warfare for the U.S. government and defense industries. Her new novel is called The Right Guard. And finally, Peg Kay, who many of you know, in the 60s, Peg was the food writer for in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and later Birmingham, Michigan newspapers. By 1970, she was research associate at the Urban Institute. She co-authored her book on government management, was a fellow in residence in the now defunct Executive Office of Telecommunications Policy. For the first half of the 1980s, she was management scientist for the Institute for Computer Sciences at the National Bureau of Standards. For the last half of 1980 through 2010, she was CEO of Vertec International Incorporated, telecommunications consultant. And from 2004 to 2012, she was president and later executive director of the Washington Academy of Sciences. Her new book is called Meet Tarzan, You Did. So What am I showing the covers, please? Tonight you'll hear from all 5 regional authors who use science in their mystery, thrillers, or horror novels. I'm going to start with Peg, because she's closest. Tell me a little bit about your books, and particularly, Peg, you were involved so much in science and dealing with a lot of scientists. Why did you want to write a novel?
Well, can you hear me?
Yes.
I've been writing all of my adult life, but always nonfiction. And then when I decided to take down my company, we figured this is not 2004, we figured we had made enough money, we could all retire. And I was sitting there in front of my computer, and I didn't have anything to write. And that had never happened to me before. So I said, well, what the heck, let's try a novel. And that's why I wrote the novel. It was a lot of fun.
Okay. Alexandra, you included a lot of technical information about defense of the military in your novel. What research did you do for this, and how did you validate your work according to the accuracy of your facts?
Okay, I need a,
That's it.
is that it?
Here.
Okay.
Wow.
We'll share this. Yeah. All right, how about this? Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Well, as a defense anthropologist and also working with the military in and out of a lot of really interesting projects and arenas, there was a lot of it I knew. And just to make sure my book was vetted before, before it was published. So, but you never know how much you know sometimes. But I certainly was around specialists in other arenas. I credited 2 people in my book for their help in also technical expertise. General Don Streeter, retired, United States Air Force general, retired. And he was, and still is, a specialist in armaments and military weapons. So when I got to certain military weapons that I wasn't quite sure about, Don actually had me come down to Tyler, and I fire them off. He'd have special permission for me to get on range. And the last time I was there, I was firing AK-47s, a Derringer. What was the other? Sorry?
40 caliber, 44 caliber.
Right, 44 caliber. It was, I mean, these were weapons that had quite a kick to it, so he helped me a great deal. Also, John Sano, who was former deputy clandestine operations at CIA, was of great help too. And I knew many people I worked with and in and out of, so I have quite a bank of individuals. And also, when I book sign, people are constantly going by my table leaving cards. The last one, there was a fellow came by and said, "You need to know about the black box in the plane that just went down, and call me." So it's really interesting how once you stick your head up and say, "Okay, I'm writing this," people also come forth and help you.
All right. Maddie, you come from the world of information technology. Why did you initially decide to write your novels in this world and put your particular spin on it?
As you might have guessed from the short bio, we tend to write humorous technology murder mysteries. And my sister, who's the other half of the writing team, and I both spent a number of years in the technology industry, mostly on the business side. We felt that the industry is just rife for lampooning, particularly when you consider some of the cult-like status that develops around some of the new technology. One of the current ones is cloud computing, where God is in charge of your data. Another, sort of in the same vein, my sister had an experience with a coworker who would not take the online training because he would have to click on a satanic symbol. So this is, these things aren't made up. This really goes on. We couldn't make some of this stuff up. So we decided that was a great area to explore. We put the novels in San Francisco, which is the quirk capital of the world, As you may know, you can march naked in a parade there, but you cannot smoke while doing so. And then our protagonist, we chose a 20-something IT consultant. 20-something because there are all sorts of fun things that go on in your life at that time. She happens to work for a consulting company that is called GD Consulting, and as you will guess, Grant Denholm Consulting, I should say, and they're called GD Consultants frequently. So I think you get the general idea. And I will say that, again, most of what's in the books, I won't speak to the murder side of it, but most of what's in the books comes from our experience just in living and being around the IT industry and being around San Francisco.
It's both Peg and you this. Was it as much fun writing them as it was being around these quirky people?
We have a blast writing them. In fact, my sister lives on the West Coast, sometime in San Francisco and part-time in Sun Valley. And we have the same warped sense of humor. And after we're writing for a while, we don't remember who wrote what. So it's fun to pick up the book and read it, and read something you're not sure if you wrote or the other person wrote, but still laughing at it because it just brings back memories. So yes, it's been a blast to write. We're having a great time.
When you were meeting scientists in your day-to-day life, did you meet equally people that you wrote into your book with?
Well, boy, let me tell you something that Elaine Beats once told me. I don't know if many of you have read Elaine's mystery novels, but she's great. She's just wonderful. But it was also clear that she was writing about a lot of people that she knew. And so I asked her, how do you avoid getting sued? And what she said was, well, if it's a guy, what you have to do is make sure that you let people know that he has a very small penis. He'll never admit that it was him.
Thank you and good.
Okay, John, your character.
There is no correlation. It's a random sample thing.
John, your character, Jonathan Grave, is a freelance rescue consultant. In one of these former interests of yours, was that something that you have done, or did you do special research for that?
Well, years ago, in 2006, I wrote a nonfiction book called 6 Minutes to Freedom, which is the story of what was then the only civilian of record ever rescued by Special Forces. It was Delta Force. It was a mission in Panama in 1989. And I got extraordinary access to that community. Thank you, General Boykin, for opening those doors for me. And you know, I've been to the Delta compound, I've been to the SEAL compound, and this is a community that, you know, you're either trusted or you're not. And I'm very fortunate to have been embraced by that. My own background, I do come from the weapons business. I'm an explosives, hazardous material, chemical weapons kind of guy, all from the safety engineering side. My job was to make sure that none of that went off when it was being handled by the good guys, that it would go off when it was going to the bad guys. I was also a firefighter and paramedic for 15 years. So I sort of bonded with this whole notion of, you know, people who go out and do very special things, more or less without recognition. And after I did the nonfiction work, I realized, excuse me, that there's a model. Maybe you don't know this, but if somebody's taken hostage in the United States, it's the FBI hostage rescue team that comes and takes care of, rescues the good guys from the bad guys. The actual mission is to make sure that the bad guy does not get away. It is not necessarily to save the life of the good guy. Overseas, when we send Delta or Navy SEALs or whoever is the mission is to bring the good guy home to hell with the bad guys. You know, there are no warrants, there's no, and I'm not suggesting the due process is not a good thing, because it is a good thing. So I got this idea of taking that foreign model where all we're about is getting the good guy from the bad guys, and have an independent contractor who has a background in that community, taking that set of priorities into domestic territory. So Jonathan Grave is a character who frequently is, as he says, on he's on the opposite side of the law, but never on the wrong side of the law. So that's where the character comes from.
Harrison, when I looked down at your book and I started reading it, and I realized what month we were in, and I realized what day we were on, it made a lot of kind of synergy. We happen to be at 12/12/2012. We're going to get to 12/21/2012, and your book has a very heavy emphasis on what's going to happen after a very terrible climate, or very terrible plague sort of event in the future. There's so much interest now in young adults and 20-somethings, particularly readers, on the post-apocalyptic world. What do you think that comes from, and how much of it is from what's come before, like 9/11 and the terrible tragedy of that, and the fact that we've come to the tsunami that came afterwards? How much is that, do you think, of that interest, and how did you pick up on wanting to do that particular kind of work?
Well, as to where it comes from, I don't think it's anything so directly related to disaster of that sort. I think dystopian fiction, post-apocalyptic fiction, is really just variation on a kind of story that has always been told, survival stories, and that's been different in different eras. In the late 19th, early 20th centuries, it might have been exploring the jungles of Africa. In the 50s, maybe it was other planets. And at this point, it's at the present time, it's ourselves in our own world in a distorted state. And I think that's where the fear of it comes, where the horror of it comes to. For something to be so recognizable and at the same time so far from our understanding and what we are used to seeing, to have to struggle to survive in a world that has made survival so easy for us at the present time. I don't think it's anything so related to a cultural drive or cultural fear of end times. I'm sure there's a factor to some extent, but I don't think it's. I think fundamentally it's just the basic element of survival. As to why I explored it, it's not like I started writing this book actually in 2005, and it wasn't a book then. It was a collection of short stories. And at the time, I don't believe the trend towards dystopian fiction was what it is now. And if it was, I was too much of a novice in the publishing field to know about it. So honestly, it's a coincidence that what I happened to write happened to come out at a time where it fits a trend that currently exists. It's a good coincidence. If people wanted to connect it to the Mayan calendar, then I'll listeners. Then in that case, the listeners, the last book you'll ever need. But there's no intent in that.
When I was looking up dystopian fiction, if you haven't, or you're unfamiliar with the term, certainly one of the first people that did it, it's well known, was H.G. Wells in The Time Machine. And certainly that has gotten, if you read that and you go through and you get to people like Orwell and Huxley and Vonnegut, and it comes all the way up to the Hunger Games, and it's interesting in the 2000s and 2010s. It's just been luminous since then, and it's just a tide, and it may be because those books have gotten to be very popular on the bestseller list, and then people write more and more and more of them. But it's certainly, looking back on those books, it may be particularly people like Huxley and Vonnegut. I keep thinking, these are some of my favorite authors. This is really a genre I really like to read. So,
But doesn't go back farther than that. I mean, you've got Nibble Shoot with On the Beach. You've got Alas Babylon. You've got you got every movie made in the 1950s.
Yes, well, it continues on. But what I mean is, it's amazing that if you look at that list, it's like these are really great books, and it's not, as you said, it's not necessarily that they look at it a particular way. And it's usually a society where it's really interesting if you look at the definition. It's usually a society which is thought of by the people that created it as being a utopia, and it's just the people that are outside of it that feel it isn't a utopia that are being swept away, and they're trying to get out of it. And it's an amazing thing. Harrison, did you look at some of the others that were written, and did you think about those, or did you just sort of, it just came to you when you started, what would happen, how would I survive? I mean, they even mentioned zombies. I know those weren't really zombies in your book. They're just very affected, sick people, right?
And they're zombies, except that they are undead, don't eat people, and can talk.
Right.
Otherwise.
Right. And they're very dangerous. It's okay.
Can they open a door?
What?
Can they open a door?
Can open a door.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
And they can
Which is
shoot.
more dangerous. Yes, and they can shoot. Don't typically, but if they have it on hand. Very distracted. What's the question?
No, I said the thing is that some people have said it's just like a zombie movie or a zombie apocalypse, and I don't think it's necessarily that. I think it's you put a lot more of thought and philosophy and not theology so much, but because you talk about God a lot. But it's a very engaging book.
Oh, thank you. There's a question here too I was supposed to answer. I don't remember what it was.
Okay, let's go down for John. Both of you and Harrison have written screenplays. How is that? I know John's tailed so low here, but how do you portray the things that you portray in books differently than you would if you wrote that screenplay for that book?
I've only adapted the works of others. I've not done an original screenplay. I'm not interested in doing an original screenplay. You know, in a perfect world, I write the book, I'll sell the movie rights, and I get hired to write the screenplay. It's the trifecta. You know, you get the 3 shots at the same story. But I have adapted Nelson DeMille and Thomas Harris and Norman MacLean and others. I think the secret is to come at a movie as a different work of art. I write a screenplay with the notion that I'm telling. Word of Honor was the Nelson DeMille screenplay. Nelson DeMille wrote his book, and it's a huge book. It's like a 600-page book. There's no way that can all be on the screen. So the story is about a man who in Vietnam, now he's a very successful businessman 20 years after Vietnam, and he gets charged with war crimes retroactive to the time. That's the nugget of the story. And I tried to stay within the sleeve of the story he's telling, but I'm not trying to recreate the book, because you can't do it. It's impossible. So I think, you know, when you look at a book that is based on a movie, or excuse me, a movie that's based on a book, you have to remember the based on thing. So for me, it's 2 entirely different art forms. They're only distant cousins to each other.
That's pretty dead on. The fundamental to screenplay adaptation is that it can't be a translation. You can't do it with a book open right next to you, typing exactly what's there. It needs to be reconceived in this new format, which is a very different format. The screenplay is a lot more structured and much more specifically structured than a novel or a short story or anything else you happen to be adapting. It's its own language, and it's only going to work if it's built from the ground up. Otherwise, you can do something that's accurate to the events of a book, but if it's not reimagined as its own entity, it's not going to have the heart. It's not going to be. It's not going to be a work in itself, which is the fundamental thing. Not so much loyalty to every word of what you're adapting, but true to the heart and rebuild with that basis. I've adapted a lot of books from other authors, and The Listeners has a particularly odd genesis in this respect because as I said, it started out as short stories. It did not go from short stories to novel. It went from short stories to screenplay to novels. So the novel is actually adapted from the screenplay, which is adapted from the short stories. And as far as that particular translation, short story to screenplay, what it was originally was a series of interconnected short stories. There were about 6 of them, and to turn that into a screenplay I was between either sort of doing an almost anthology style, or which would not have been reconceived, which would have been just trying to be true to what it's already doing, which is not what needs to be done for a screenplay adaptation. So I expanded one of the stories, built on drastically, especially what comes after. Over the process, Daniel, the protagonist of that story, which was called The Listeners, he went from 17 to 14. The first person narrative became this more distant screenplay with much more of an introverted story, which is strange for going to a visual medium, but that's how it turned out. And it's needed to, and the other stories end up sort of popping up as they would naturally be encountered by the protagonist, by Daniel, and it became this better structured 3-act story, and that gave me the form and structure I needed to turn the whole thing into a novel as well, that broader story. That too required changes, as it always will, because all these things are different forms with their own languages, require their own approach.
Most of you include quite a lot of technical information in your book, but yet your books don't seem to overwhelm the reader, the layperson. Are you aware of that ability, and how do you go about consciously doing it when you write? And secondly, how much of your research, how much of your time is spent doing research as opposed to just typing away your novel? Okay.
Well, this particular novel, I didn't have to do an awful lot of research because I was at the Institute. I was also well known at the Institute of being a technical dummy. So people explain things to me, and that's what got translated into the book. The next one, I'm going to need a lot of help.
Okay. Alexandra?
2 questions. One was research. And
Well, one of them was you all use quite a lot of technical information that you impart, and how do you impart that without having people's eyes glass over and flip the pages off?
Okay. Can you hear me well? I'll switch to a lavalier. I'm pretty good. About this first book, again, first of a trilogy, The Right Guard, I didn't have to do that much research with it because I was very familiar with a number of the events that surrounded the situation. And I would say most of the research I did on this, about 25%, was newspaper clippings. Most of my chapters begin with a piece from a newspaper article and they're all real, and they're documented in the back of the book, which gives it quite a different flavor. And if you read the newspaper articles, you actually get the gist of the story of what was going on in the background. So I'd say with this book about 25%. And I'm sorry, the second.
No, I just want to know.
The second.
You actually answered both of them.
Okay.
How much you write technical information into your books, but how do you decide how much is too much?
Yes, we're very conscious of having a readership that goes from sort of the 20-something sophisticated user of IT to the 88-year-old know very little and care less about IT. One being my daughter and the other being my mother, but plus others in those groups. So that's a good bracket in terms of us trying to meet the needs of both of them. In terms of we want the technology to be in there, we want it to be explained so that people can understand it, but not dumbed down. If people don't get all of it, that's okay. The plot is about human nature, not about bits and bytes. As for research, I think it's hard to know because I think a lot of people are structured writers in terms of seeing what they want to do. They've got the outline, they do the research, they do the writing, they do the rewriting, they're done. My sister and I tend to write in vignettes. We see pieces of things happening with an idea of a structure. We do enough research to ensure that if you watch Mythbusters, I think we're searching for the plausible. That is, if it's not confirmed, it's something that's been tested or done in a laboratory setting or controlled circumstances, but it's not something that would typically happen unless it was a ideal set of circumstances. We're in there to make the technology interesting, but we don't want to give people a how-to manual of how to kill people because it's supposed to be funny.
Let me answer that, which I did early, and I'll be brief. I have been used to writing very technical cultural information to commanders in the field about a cultural crisis, and to identify that very quickly, come back and say, here's the situation you're about to walk into. So in those briefings, I've been used to many, many years writing masses of information, bringing it down to size very quickly so it's very easily understood. The interesting thing is that that skill came back automatically when I began to do the same thing in writing this novel. So it was an old skill reused.
Okay.
I think that research is one of the great time sucks that exists. You can, as a writer, you can get yourself so embraced and embedded in research that you never actually write anything. So here's my theory. I happen to have a set of technical knowledge that plays to my strengths. I know explosives, I know weapons, I know that kind of stuff, just because. The rest of it, I make up. For the most part. If there is a way to track someone or to kill someone, there is a top secret CIA project out there looking how to do it. And I know this because I got a call from a Navy SEAL buddy of mine a couple of years ago for there's a bit of satellite technology and threat warning, my third in the Jonathan Gray book. And he called me and he was pretty pissed because we have this agreement that I don't reveal the actual stuff that I see. And as he went on, I started to laugh, and he said, John, it's not funny. I said, yeah, it really is, because I made it up. You know, I didn't talk to anybody about this. The fact is that what I had imagined intersected with what actually exists. So here's the thing about writing fiction. My job as an author is to convince you that my character knows how to do what he can do. I don't have to know how to do what he can do. So I think one of the keys to writing, it's a book a year, and my books are all about pace. You start on page 1, and it's holy cow, we're off and we're running. So if there's any point where I eject a reader out of a story by using a word that I haven't defined, or by using model X304/6 or whatever it is, I'm not doing my job. What I'm doing then is showing off. So my job as an author is to keep the reader constantly in the story, to keep the pace constantly going. And to do that, you use sleight of hand. So the point of research is to not screw it up. Not so much to know so much more. In writing Damage Control, for example, it's set in Mexico. It's a hostage rescue situation in Mexico. I was writing along and I realized, I wonder what kind of vehicles the Mexican army uses. Because they're not going to use Humvees, they're going to use something else. Go to the internet, write in Mexican army vehicles, and you get a hit. It's called a Sandcat, and they have pictures of it. Cool, I'm done. Put it in the book, move on. So that's, for me, research is about creating an image of knowledge that the character has. It does not require me to be able to have the technical skills to do what Jonathan Gray does.
You guys all made me feel a lot better about myself. Because I was thinking, what am I doing on this panel? I didn't do enough research. But that's one of the things I will say to authors sometimes. Is that it's more important to write with authority than actually to have it. And that's exactly the case. In my case. My characters are not coming from a position of knowledge about science. They're coming from a position of ignorance. They don't know what's going on. They're quarantined. They are trapped. They're just trying to survive. So the science with the plague element, this thing that's lurking in the background that they only know bits and pieces and rumors and whispers of. And as long as those are convincing enough to be frightening, then it works. And of course, when it comes to things that are actively in the story, I want to make sure that that makes sense as possible, that I'm being specific, because if you don't have the specific details, that will come out. It'll seem generalized. It will seem inauthentic. I did like research. I researched guns. I didn't know anything about them, but characters are there and they have them. I want to make sure I was specific about what kind they were using, and how many bullets each one would have. Things like that. Things that were immediately relevant to the characters. That I researched. That's going to be accurate. Beyond that, it's going in as much as I needed to convince in the course of the novel.
Okay, we'd be interested to read or hear about how much time you actually write each day. How much time do you spend writing?
I'll start with that one. Typically, I spend about 4 hours a day doing things that are book-related, be it research or writing. I will admit that since we acquired a mini Schnauzer puppy, that's dropped to 0. I hope to pick it up again after the new year. But I think 3 or 4 hours a day is about all I can manage before I'm tired.
Do you set your pace in a number of hours? I mean, number of words, or just hours?
Well, if I'm in full-blown writing mode, it's number of words. And they don't have to be good words. There's a book called Bird by Bird by, I think it was Anne Lamott, about writing a book. And she says you have to give yourself permission to write, in her words, a shitty first draft. And so I do a lot of that, and I'll say I have to write at least 500 words or whatever it is. So that's when in full-blown writing mode. But when you get into editing mode and things of that nature, you really have to set the clock, because it's very easy to say, I'm tired of looking at this and I'm just going to walk away from it.
Okay, one thing I wanted to mention, what you just said, a very good friend of ours and mine, Laura Lippman, was on Facebook today and said that, I've got to totally revise this book, and I've never heard her admit that before. And she's at the top of her game, and you would imagine that she would think, I can't write anything bad, But she came right on Facebook and said, I'm going to totally revise this book, or throw it out and start over again or something. That's really amazing to me. Peg, how much time do you write?
I think pretty much the same amount of time that Nettie does. I don't keep track of it. I sit down and write, and when I get sick of writing, I stop. But it usually comes to about 3 or 4 hours.
Is that it?
I think it's important to write something every day. I don't necessarily put a number of words on it, and I don't put a number of hours on it, but when I'm in full writing mode, it is at least a couple of hours. I always try to get through a couple of scenes, and a scene to me is a chapter. And I will stop for the day in the middle of the scene. I never finish it, because if you're in the middle of the scene, it's so much easier to pick it up at the next moment.
Really?
Otherwise, you're sitting there thinking, what am I going to do with it? What happens next if you don't have an outline? And even when you do, sometimes the outline doesn't fit. The characters, I think anybody on this panel will tell you, once you start writing, the characters take a life of their own. And I had 32 characters in this book. I will never do that again, ever. Because you think of eye color, hair color, personality quirks for these people. And you have to, a novel is a huge piece of work. So you can't leave it too long, because then it gets cold and you've got to go back over it again. So it's important to be consistent with something every day.
I remember Mary Higgins Clark telling me that she had to live on a very long hallway in her house. And I said, why was that? And she says, because of all these pieces of paper I have to. She was one of these people that did a linear diagram of her entire work. And then the other way of doing it, of course, is sort of what Alexandra said, and then there's a third way, which I've always loved too, which was the way that Tony Hillman did it. And he said he just dropped the pebble into the water, and the ripples that came out from it was where the book was going to head. And that you can see that in his work. I mean, that you can see that he has this like glimmering image somewhere in that book, and everything else just like radiates out from it. Okay, John, how about you? How much?
Well, I'm going to be the contrarian, I think. For my characters, they just stare at me until I tell them what to do. I keep waiting for them. I keep waiting for them to take on a mind of their own and do the stuff I hear about. Nope, they just sit there and say, "That's right, dude. It's your story. What do you want me to do?" And so for me, I don't have. I'm the only writer I know who reached success fairly early in my writing career, and with the first 2 books and 2 movie deals and all this, wrote full-time for 6 or 7 years and really hated it. And I went back to a full-time day job. So I now work 10 hours a day. I travel a lot I'm an executive for a trade association here in DC. And I am more prolific as a part-time writer than I ever was as a full-time writer. And most of the production for me, I have an October 15th deadline. So I just delivered a book. So now I'm in that grace period where I'm thinking about the next book, outlining the next book. I've already sent in the synopsis for the next book so that you get that payment. But it's just the outline. And there's really good TV on now, so I watch that. We're going to get into American Idol soon. And I'll kind of tap away, and then come July 15th, so between mid-July to October 15th, I'll write 50,000 words, or 60,000 words. Because now I'm in panic mode, it's on the deadline, holy shit, I gotta get this thing done. And I become very aware of pacing then. And I become very aware of the fact that I'm very difficult to live with at that point. And my wife's not here, ask her, she'll tell you. So I'm basically undisciplined. And when the spirit moves me early on, I will write. The beginning of a book is lovely. I love writing the first 70 pages, 100 pages, because it's all, it's the beginning and you get the action. My books run 120,000 words, so they're pretty meaty books. And then I get to that 200-page mark where all the exposition has to happen and it's really hard and everything is more interesting. That's when I'll start outlining the next book, because the next book is more interesting than what I'm doing right now. And then the reality of the deadline hits, and then you get back in the story and you're right. So I'm basically an undisciplined adolescent writer, but it works. I've done 11 books now and it works. But it's always the same pattern. And sometime in late September, when I'm screaming and my eyes are bleeding and things are off, I'm never doing this again. And then, of course, we all know.
Well, the short answer is not enough. And the thing of it is that when your day job is editing and you're looking at writing all day, it's not the first thing you feel like doing when you come home. Unfortunately. Which is not to say that I'm not doing various things. I'm currently in the middle of a screenplay, a short story, a musical, and I guess a number of unrelated songs unrelated to that musical. And actually, I've kind of been spending a lot of time and more and fairly disciplined time, I suppose, with the songwriting primarily because it's different from the editing. At first, I figured it was just where the muse was taking me. Then I decided that no, I'm actually doing that because it's easier, and it shouldn't be because it's easier. So basically, I just need to be more disciplined than I am, and get back to one of the things. Probably the screenplay. I like the screenplay. I enjoy doing that. As for as far as devoting time toward crapping novels, it's not so much where I am at right now.
Okay, I'm going to ask you something very difficult. I am a publisher, and I am going to decide whether to take your book on. I want you to tell me in a couple words what your book's about.
darned if I know.
You're not gonna get published.
The real honest answer.
Well, I didn't.
Tell me what your book's about.
The book's about life in the federal government, one, and two, it's set in 1991, and it's where computer science was at that time. And we happily knock off a few people
Who needed
Pardon?
who needed to be killed.
Oh, yeah, yeah. None of the good guys get killed. But it's generally it's more of a study of the bureaucracy than anything else, which is that not all bureaucrats are bad guys. And a lot of them are very good guys indeed, and they try their best. Sometimes it doesn't work out, and they get killed.
You read a piece. You read a piece.
In a perfect world.
You read a piece for Jane at BBC. You were talking about a particular scientific part of it. What was that?
Well, what the agency is doing is attempting to make a two-handed robot. If you look at something like an assembly line, they only use one hand. You know, there's a hand that comes out and holds something, and then the other hand does something. Well, you can't really do that in space. You know, there you are up there, and both hands have to maneuver without clobbering one another. That's a very hard problem. It certainly was in 1991, and I'm not sure they've ever solved it. So that's what they're doing in the lab. And the robot's name, I should tell you, is Tarzan. And the book's name is Me, Tarzan, You, Dead.
Yes. Okay. Sandra?
I've practiced this so many
Your elevator speech.
The elevator speech, because whenever you meet a publisher and you're trying to get published, you got it. You're 30-second. Okay, here goes. It is the first of a trilogy, a suspense thriller, intelligent spy story based on real events and my personal experience. Over 1 million weapons are missing throughout the United States, and it is just, the intelligence community has just begun to realize that the weapons are moving out of the arsenals. And now they're just beginning to understand that a movement may be afoot. They don't know who it is, they don't know what it is they want, and they don't know where the weapons are.
Okay. Maddie?
Well, you said a couple words, so a couple words would be, it's hysterical.
Okay.
If you want more than that, I'd read the blurb off the book, which I spent a lot of time on.
Right.
But,
And we must mention that there's surfing in it. Tell them about some of the other aspects besides the IT.
Well,
It's not all computers.
oh, no, absolutely not. Let me read the blurb because that gives you about as much as anything. Most definitely not a private investigative, detective, beat cop, sidekick, or a girlfriend of any of the above. Emma Jones, nonetheless, has an alarming penchant for close encounters of the corpse kind. This time she finds peace activist Laguna Butterfield pierced with a protest placard 3 days after Emma's landlady Magna threatened to kill her. Whether she's infiltrating the anti-war Limo group to track down Laguna's killer, consulting at a recently devoured or acquired candy company, or surfing in shark-infested waters, Emma faces the angry and aggrieved at every turn. Even her Ipo, sweetie, Keone, is aggressively advocating for Hawaiian sovereignty. Sometimes saving a friend from a truly heinous orange jumpsuit requires becoming a fashion victim yourself. Emma prays that wearing lime green is the worst that happens this time around.
Okay, John?
You see, you stole my thunder. I was going to say off the top of my head, and then I was going to read the back of my book. But now I
still
can't do that.
You still can.
Well, we talked about with Jonathan Grave is a freelance hostage rescue specialist, and in damage control, He's in Mexico to do a routine ransom drop. $3 million, you get the good guys back, and everything that can go wrong possibly go wrong does. And now Jonathan and his PC, Precious Cargo, and his team are 1,000 miles deep into the drug. Mexico's a scary place. It is really a scary place. So he's got 1,000 miles to come back from the jungles of Mexico to make it back to the United States, and he's wanted by Interpol, he's wanted by the Mexicans, he's wanted by all God's children, and it turns out that someone in the seat of power in this very city is trying to take him out. Bum, bum, bum.
Harrison?
Horrified by the notion that somebody in this city could be up to no good.
It is fiction.
I've been screenplays. I can do an elevator pitch. In a borough quarantined due to an airborne illness that causes deformity, insanity, and death, a 14-year-old boy named Daniel, orphaned by the plague, is caught up with a one-eared gang/cult called the Listeners. But all he really wants is to find his best friend Katie, trapped elsewhere in the quarantine.
That was like better than everybody else.
Oh, shall we?
I've been saying that for years.
Well, I think it's time to open it up to the other listeners. Who has some questions for our audience? Yes. You have to shout it out because it's on tape.
Well, my first question, because I think that this is all such an interesting endeavor. I'm part of the Toastmasters, and one of the things that they help us to do is to find good beyond the analysis paralysis and how to be succinct and how to be engaging. How do you come up with, of your many ideas, which one are you going to run with first?
Whoa. Anybody got ideas? Harrison?
Well, I guess it goes back to what I was saying before, being in the middle of several different things. I used to do that, where I decided what I was going to run with first and just devote all my energy to that one particular project until it was done. I found I've gotten a lot more productive since I stopped doing that and started going with whatever fit my mindset, fit where I was at that particular time. Which, I mean, obviously that has left some things undone. It's left a lot more finished as before. It's actually been, even though I haven't been terribly productive in writing prose screenplays lately, I've never been more productive in writing songs, which is one of the things I do. I don't think it's so much making a decision like that, so much as just going in the direction that you feel taken to move in.
Yeah, for me, it's the first book in the Jonathan Graves series was No Mercy, and that was sort of introducing this character and kind of exploring him, and it worked very well. I thought it worked very well. With Hostage Zero, which is the second book, what we established in the first book is that Jonathan Graves, first of all, he's fabulously wealthy, and he's also quite the philanthropist, and he has endowed this place called Resurrection House, which is a home. It's his old childhood mansion that he's given away for $1. But he's endowed this to be the home for the children of incarcerated parents. So I got this cool idea of, what if some idiot kidnapped somebody from that school? That's where Hostage Zero came from. It was too cool an idea not to work with it. In the case of Threat Warning, which is the third book, I was walking across the Woodrow Wilson Bridge, which you can do that now. It's a lovely spring day. It's a great walk to go from Old Town Alexandria over to the resort place, whatever it's called.
National Harbor.
The National Harbor, thank you. And I thought, wow, what a cool place for a terrorist with a machine gun. At rush hour, nobody had any place to go. So I got an opening scene, and then I fit a book around it. In the case of Damage Control, I wanted Jonathan to be the hunted instead of the hunter. So it's a matter, for me, it's either starting with a very strong image or a very strong premise, and then building the story around it, which for me, it's outlines. I am an obsessive outliner. Not so much beat by beat, but the beginning, the middle, the end. Where am I going to go? Who's going to live? Who's going to die? How are we going to get there? I do all of that as an outline. And if the outline doesn't hold up, I know it won't be a book. If it does hold up, then I know I can go there.
I'm not sure I can give you a good answer for that, but there's two things that go on. One is when you are writing a series, you want to have the characters evolve. You don't want them to sort of not learn and grow. So they evolve and the relationship evolves. So that's sort of one thing that goes on. The second is, again, just sort of, over time, seeing things on the internet or seeing things in the news, we have a file going of interesting ways to kill somebody or interesting, things that we should be using in the book. Recently, we were reading some things about the vulnerability of medical implanted devices. It says, that's a great way to knock someone off. So it sort of hit us that would be a fun one to explore. And so that's kind of the one we took for a short story we're working on now. And then I guess the other thing is because Emma is a consultant, she can move to different locales and have different adventures there. And we really want to spend a little more time in Hawaii, so the third book she's in Hawaii on assignment, and we have more research to do there.
I think in my case it was, again, personal experience dictated, that this is what I was going to do now because it was a time to write it. The first draft of this book was written in 1978. Jimmy Carter was in office. The Iran hostages were making the news. It was a terrible, I don't know how many of you remember this, but a terrible economic time. People were kicking around a word called stagflation. I don't know if you remember that. So the interesting thing is that when I decided to finish this, it came out in a period that people think that without reading the first page in 1978, they think it was written today. And many people, if you read some of my reviews on Amazon, many people have said, my gosh, I suddenly realized this was not a 2012 story. The second and third one, of course, will bring it up to date. But in my case, it was personal experience based on real events that I took the ideas, that took the precedent. I keep a file now of plots simmering and ideas of what I'm going to do with the next book. My husband and I will visit someplace, and I'll think, this is a good place for a murder, or this is a good place for somebody to be shot, or gee, that's a great place to hide something. And I'll write that down, napkins, pieces of paper, anything. I have all these little hardback books, and I'll write all this stuff down so that I won't forget it. And I haven't got an iPad yet, so it's. I think you go with what works, what feels good at the moment. It's a time to do this, or you see something in the paper or on the net that thinks this is something that will be of interest in the public, and the story works.
Okay.
In the beginning, I had an idea. And then, as you write, or at least as I write, other ideas pop up. And like Alexandra, I've got notes. And, well, this is going to be the premise of the second book, and this is going to be the premise of the third book. And hey, if I can't do it in that time frame for some reason or another, like my expert consultant is out of commission, then I flip them. But I don't think anybody squanders a lot of ideas on one book.
Yes.
Actually, you've given me some ideas. My first husband and I, for comic relief as scientists, we used to strategize all the many ways to murder people and not get caught. And in fact, every time we talk now, and we talk frequently, we ask each other, have you thought of any interesting new ways to kill somebody? And no, we didn't work for the CIA.
And to this day, you haven't been caught.
There's a story there, talking. But the question I have is, there probably was a time in your life when you knew you wanted to write fiction, and I'd like to know when in your life it was. And what was the catalyst that got you to sit down and actually start writing that very first book?
Anybody want to start with that?
I remember mine distinctly. I was 11 years old, and I was in elementary school, and I never really liked to write. I still don't like to write to this day. I can't stop it. It's a passion.
Wow.
It is a need for creativity and expression that just comes out in the written word. But I was 11 years old, and I wrote my first novel, My Surprise Trip to Africa. I still have it. And I wrote that because instead of going out to play at recess, I noticed that there was a very small book room and they had a typewriter in there. And I asked the teacher, could I go in there and play at recess? And every day at recess for many weeks, I would slip into that room and write on that typewriter. And finally, somebody missed me on the playground. And the teachers made me come out and they said, you really need to get integrated with the other children. And you can't do this anymore. So then my parents got me something that I could do this at home. But I was 11 years old. I knew then that there was something magical about putting it on the page. It's hard work, make no mistake. You know, if you really love what you do and you do it right, it is hard work. But I've tried to quit a couple of times and I just can't do it.
I'll try next. I never knew I wanted to be a writer, but I alluded to a sort of a warped sense of humor, and that came out in just about everything I did. Even at work, I would write fake. They had administrative bulletins about certain things, and I would make up fake admin bulletins and circulate them. It may have had something to do with my stunting my career, but I figured that this was a more legitimate outlet for my need to poke fun at things and just, you know, let it all out. And so my sister, having somewhat the same problem, and I just joined together, decided to do it. And it's been very late in life. If you'd asked me when I was 20 if I'd ever end up writing a novel, you gotta be kidding, I don't know how to write. But after lots of life experiences and so forth, it's like, this is fun. I really, really, really enjoy it. It's hard work, but it's a blast.
Yeah, I can't really agree that it's hard work. I just thought it a tremendous amount of fun. I enjoy going down and writing. I sometimes look at it and say this is terrible and tear it up, but that's also fun. I should comment on my government career. After my government career, I was a contractor with the General Accounting Office. And I decided, you had to write these, reports, on how you did, and the COTR would read them, and I decided, or at least he claimed he did, and I decided, well, since nobody reads these things, I would put jokes in there all the way through. And one day after, long after the GAO contract, I ran into the COTR at Potomac Mills. And he said, Peg, I've missed you. And I said, why? He says, you were the only reports I ever read because they were the only ones that had jokes in them.
Love it.
Okay.
John,
I don't think I've ever not been writing. I still have my first story from kindergarten. It's about the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. But that doesn't. But I did not necessarily know though that I wanted to be a writer. It wasn't until 8th grade that I figured that out. And that actually came from reading the letters page of a Spider-Man comic. And it was some comment like whenever I see the name James Mattis in the credits, he's my favorite comic writer. Whenever I see his name in the credits, I know it's going to be a great book. And that's the first time it occurred to me that this was a job that people actually had, that people actually did for a living, and I want to do that for a living too. And that it was originally the goal was to write Spider-Man comics. It's expanded from that to writing various things. But from that point on, I knew writing was what I was going to pursue.
For me, communicating in general is the only thing I've ever been good at. You know, I know I look like a professional basketball player, but the reality is I've never been very good at athletics. And for as long as I can remember, I've always written. It's the matter of constructing sentences and making stories and moving people. It's always been very important to me. I think that my ability, or to the degree that I have, it's hard to self-aggrandizing terms here, but my ability to construct fiction and not to go all dark and heavy. I mean, there's a facile answer to this question, and then there's the real answer to this. I had a very interesting childhood with a lowercase I, and I lived a fiction. It was a survival skill to find a way to twist reality to be something other than what it was, and that was the space that I lived in. I didn't realize this until much later. And actually, writing turns out to be now we're getting all woo-woo. I don't think that there's woo-woo in writing, but the reality is that all of my fiction has such a sense of justice over injustice, and the good guys triumphing over the bad guys, and the abused getting vengeance on the abuser. And I know we're not talking Jerry Sandusky stuff here, okay? So for me, it's something I've always done. I mean, always constructing this world where I wanted to live in, and I'm blessed with the ability to then to chronicle it in writing. I think that if you can't do that, if you live in this space and then you can't channel it through writing, I think they call it psychosis. It's a matter of being able to create a world that's not just it's not just therapeutic, it's entertaining, and to be able to make that transition then is self-fulfilling. So what you do is you take this fictional world and you mix it up and you throw in all the good guys versus the bad guys, and on the other end you have folks who have been entertained in the process, and it is just a magical feeling. It's addictive.
Yeah, having read a lot of mysteries and thrillers and procedurals and working as a scientist and knowing a lot of scientists, I would say there are out there lots of stereotypic characteristics that scientists and technology folks have to have. And I'm wondering if, when you're drawing your characters, you feel kind of beholden to those kinds of stereotypes to produce a successful character that people will believe is a scientist or a technologist, or if that's really not necessary.
I don't think that you necessarily need to stick to stereotypes. I think characters that have unusual features or flaws. This just comes to mind. Ian Fleming. I don't even know how many of you know that Ian Fleming was in the British Secret Service, and actually, I'll give you a little piece of information that'll win you a beer. He actually wrote Chitty Chitty Bang Bang when you're drinking at a bar. But I don't think he wrote, Ian Fleming, the so-called beautiful women in James Bond novels. They always had a flaw. There was always something about them. One had a broken nose, or one had a scar, but there was always something. And he took it, something that was different or unusual that characterized her differently. I think that makes for interesting characters. Some characters are stereotypical. A good author uses both. But the most interesting to me is when you create a very unusual character. And sometimes it's out of somebody you know. And people say, gee, that was real. Was that somebody you really knew? And I think that's when you know you've done a good job. But I don't think they have to be stereotypical. I think the more interesting characters, as you know, in real life, certainly nobody's perfect. Nobody fits a mold completely, and people are unusual in such different ways. I think when you can do that with a character, your story is more believable. And then as a writer, I can get you to suspend belief and go with me on the adventure.
I think anytime that you're flirting with stereotype, you're flirting with disaster in terms of writing a book, because you don't want it to be predictable. You want to be different, and to the degree that it's feasible. But the stereotypical lab rat kind of whether it's computer scientist or those guys, and we're talking about my son and his friends now, okay? the Big Bang Theory kind of stereotypes can be very entertaining, but they're not necessarily dramatic. So I think if you're writing comedy, you go, which I don't, you go one way, but if you're writing drama, I think that it's important to make the characters different from what the reader is expecting. That's how you get drama, you get suspense, and you get interest.
You get one back.
Yeah, we at Toastmasters are working on a very reduced time scale, like 5 to 7 minutes, and that's how we prepare it. So we deal with humor, most probably in one-liners, incorporated in the speech itself. How do you deal with humor?
That's something people ask me all the time. We had Donna Andrews, of course, who you might have heard on this panel. She and I had a long thing about humorous mysteries, and she's actually taught it. And people who don't read mysteries, they think that's very bizarre. Is that how could you have a mystery that has humor in it? And I don't think there's any out there actually that don't. I mean, you can't have, from a reader's standpoint, you can't just go on for pages and pages and pages of drama. It drives you crazy.
I can answer just from one aspect of it. You know, Shakespeare in his dramas, when he would take the audience to a certain level and he couldn't take you any further in your emotions, he'd bring out a fool on stage, or he'd bring out a comic or a drunkard. And if the humor would break the tension, and then he would begin to build it back again. I think in a mystery, in my book, one of the guys finds a warhead, and he brings it. It's small enough that he actually brings it into a hotel room to a CIA handler in a gym bag, and the tension was so strong at that point. I had to break it. So I broke the tension, and I won't tell you what I did with humor for his CIA handler. And it took it right down so that I was able to build it back up again. I think if you use humor as a tool, and Shakespeare taught all of us how to do that, there are many other fine writers that did it, but if you can use it as a tool of some sort in mysteries, I think it can be extremely helpful.
Yeah, stress without humor is whining after a while, I think, in fiction. You know, I remember, and I think humor plays a role in real life. I remember rolling up, when I was in the fire service, rolling up on an apartment fire where it was lit. I mean, it was like a city block was on fire. It had people hanging out the windows and shit, and it was just, I was the first arriving engine company, thank God I was not in charge. And the guy who was in charge, fellow named Carl Persing, steps out, and I was his second, and we're standing there, like the whole world's on fire. There's not enough water on the planet for this right now. And he puts his hands on his hips, and he says, "Well, shit, we are 911." You know, and he was able to capture. You know, we got nobody to call. We got to figure out something to do with this. So I think it's that kind of humor in the middle of drama. It focuses people. You know, it kind of lifts it up. Okay, dude, we gotta go. So, you know, that's the kind of humor that you'll find in my book. For me, if I try to write funny, it's a disaster. But if humor grows out of the interaction of characters, as seen in Hostage Zero, where they're digging up a mine that had been planted in this pathway where they're going, and Boxer's, Jonathan's buddy is like 6 foot huge, and a very big guy, and not a lot of sense of humor. And Jonathan's digging up this mine. He said, "You might want to step back." And Boxer says, "If you kill me, I'll kick your ass for all eternity." You know, I win either way. So, you know, it's that kind of, I think, putting that into a book, but I think it's also a problem that, you know, in a thriller, which is what I write, sometimes you want the reader to scream. And there's a point in writing where it's very tense for the writer, and you know it's going to be very tense for the reader, and you want to throw out something, and then you realize, what would Hitch do? You know, what would Hitchcock do? And he's not going to let you off the hook. You know, he gets it. At the beginning of the book, you can do that stuff, but when you're really screaming, let it scream. So I think there's a balance. You know, it's fine to be funny when it's time, but you got to be a little bit careful.
Well, I just have to say, we just look at everything warped anyway, so most of it is funny. And again, I'm not dealing with, well, other than murder, real serious issues.
Aside from that,
So, it just comes out. I mean, and again, putting it in San Francisco, I mean, you can walk out the door and you're laughing your head off at some of the things that are going on. So, just in there.
yeah, they're different books. The books that Maddie and someday I hope I will write are a lot different than the thrillers. You know, and at least I found that rather than breaking a book up, a serious book up with laughter, I found myself putting in a serious scene every once in a while to break the humor. That's kind of one of the problems that I've had with. How do you pronounce that Ivanovic's name? Is that right? Ivanovich. Yeah, that's one of the problems I've had with her books. Is that they just keep going on funny, and then you decide enough. So, you know, at least in this book, there are a couple scenes which were serious. And it's just exactly the opposite of what you guys are writing, where you're breaking up the seriousness with humor. I think both Maddie and I are doing the same thing, is we're every once in a while throwing in something that's not quite laughable.
It all fundamentally comes from the same place. It all comes from humanity. It's a matter of the reaction of the individual person, the individual character. And I'm working on a dramedy screenplay right now, and ostensibly it's a comedy. The first scene is somebody sitting in the computer screen and crying. It's a comedy. They're not far removed fundamentally, but certainly very much the case that each need to know when, and to have a sense of the scene you're writing, have a sense of the time of the story, know what is going to work where. I have one of the I mentioned before that the Listeners was originally a series of short stories. The short stories, most of them are still there as respites, as sort of interludes. One of them is funny, but I knew that when I was trying to figure out where to place all of them, that one had to be the first of them, because if it came later, it would break the tension away I did not want. It would limit the drama. Coming in early is a place where it still fits and works to provide a different perspective on what's going on in the world of the novel, without causing the reader not to take the rest of it seriously.
Okay. One more question. Yeah.
Oprah just started up her book club again. Are you guys ready for when she calls you?
Right. Oprah just started her book club.
That's right.
She just restarted it.
Yeah, she
Of course. Would you recommend all of us?
No, well, I hope you recommend them by going out and purchasing their books. We have to stop because we have to get you out there and talk to these people. But thank you very much for coming, and I hope Peg invites us back next year. And the Academy. Thank you, Academy.
Thanks.